If you were asked to find France on a map, your finger would probably land right here in Western Europe. And yeah, you'd be correct. It's that iconic hexagon shape sandwiched between the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, the English Channel, and a bunch of neighbors like Germany, Spain, and Italy. You'd probably also remember to include the island of Corsica, right? Good. But here's the thing. That's not actually the full picture. Not even close. If you zoom out, way out, you'll start noticing little specks of France scattered all over the globe. I'm talking about remote tropical islands in the Pacific, dense, snake-infested jungles in South America, and even rocky, windswept shores off the coast of Canada. In total, there are 13 territories that make up what's officially called overseas France, and together, they are home to over 2.8 million people. So, how did France end up with a chunk of South America? Why do they have islands near Antarctica? And how did an empire that was once the second biggest on Earth shrink down to just these remnants? Let's rewind way back. It's the early 1500s. France is a powerhouse, strong army, booming economy, and all the potential in the world to start grabbing land across the Atlantic like Spain and Portugal were already doing. But here's the thing about the French. They were late to the party, not because they couldn't, but because they were distracted. Their first real attempt came in 1524 when a guy named Giovanni da Verrazzano, yes, an Italian working for France, sailed along the North American coast. He mapped things out, but no one stuck around. Then in 1534, Jacques Cartier showed up, found the St. Lawrence River, claimed the land for France, and called it New France. He even built a little fort, but within 2 years, abandoned. And honestly, that became a pattern. In 1555, a French explorer tried to start a colony in Brazil, right where Rio de Janeiro sits today. It became a refuge for French Protestants, the Huguenots, who were being persecuted back home. Sounded promising, right? Well, 12 years later, the Portuguese showed up and crushed it. Then they tried Florida twice. First in 1562, then again in 1564. The Spanish wiped them out both times. I mean, talk about bad luck. So for a while, France just gave up on the whole colonial thing. They had religious wars at home, and nobody had the energy to deal with overseas disasters. But then came the 1600s, and everything changed. France realized something. All that land they'd claimed in Canada, it wasn't just empty wilderness. It was loaded with resources. Fish, sure, but more importantly, beavers. Yeah, beavers. Their fur was pure gold in Europe. Suddenly, colonialism had a business model. So they started building trading posts. Tadoussac in 1599, Port Royal in 1605, and then in 1608, a guy named Samuel de Champlain founded a little settlement that would become the city of Quebec. From there, the French moved deeper into the continent. They pushed into the Great Lakes, made alliances with Native American tribes, and started building a network that stretched across the heart of North America. But even then, New France was tiny compared to the English colonies down the coast. Why? Because nobody wanted to move there. It was cold, remote, and not exactly inviting. The French crown had to get creative. In the 1660s, King Louis XIV basically said, "Alright, we're making this a royal province." He sent soldiers for protection, and then he pulled a genius move. He shipped over hundreds of young women, about 800 of them, to marry the settlers. They were called the king's daughters. And guess what? The population doubled in less than a decade. But the real expansion came from the fur traders. These guys were obsessed. They kept pushing west, looking for new rivers, new animals, new profits. In 1673, Louis Joliet and Father Jacques Marquette paddled down the Mississippi, thinking maybe it led to the Pacific. It didn't, but they made it all the way to Arkansas. Then in 1682, a guy named René Robert Cavalier went all the way to the Gulf of Mexico, planted a cross, and claimed the entire Mississippi basin for France. He named it Louisiana, after his king. By the end of the 1600s, France had an empire, not just in North America, but everywhere. They'd planted flags in the Caribbean, Guadeloupe, Martinique, Saint-Domingue, which is now Haiti. They'd grabbed chunks of South America, French Guiana. They'd set up shop in West Africa, Senegal. They even had a foothold in India, with trading posts like Pondicherry. This was the first French colonial empire, and it was huge. But empires attract enemies, and France's biggest enemy, Britain. The trouble started in the early 1700s with the War of the Spanish Succession. By the time it ended, France had lost Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, and part of the Caribbean. Then came the War of the Austrian Succession. Then, the 7 Years' War, which was basically the first real world war. In North America, it was called the French and Indian War, and it started small. In 1754, a young British officer named George Washington got into a skirmish with French troops in Pennsylvania. That tiny fight snowballed into a global conflict. By 1763, France had lost badly. They gave up almost everything in North America, Canada, the Great Lakes, the Ohio Valley. They handed Louisiana to Spain as a consolation prize. In India, they were reduced to a few tiny trading posts. The first French Empire was basically over. But France wasn't done, not even close. A few decades later, Napoleon Bonaparte burst onto the scene. He had bigger things in mind than just Europe. But his colonial plans? A mixed bag. First, he secretly got Louisiana back from Spain in 1800. Then, almost immediately, he sold it to the United States in 1803 for $15 million. Why? He needed cash for his wars in Europe, and frankly, he didn't see the point in holding onto a massive, hard-to-defend territory when he could fund his army instead. Then there was Haiti, the richest colony in the world, sugar, coffee, slaves. But in 1791, the enslaved people rose up. It was the only successful slave revolt in history. Napoleon sent troops to crush it. They failed. By 1804, Haiti was independent, and during the Napoleonic Wars, Britain swooped in and grabbed whatever French colonies they could: Mauritius, Seychelles, St. Lucia. Some came back after the war, some didn't. So by 1815, France's empire was a shadow of what it had been. But here's where it gets interesting. Instead of giving up, France started over. In 1830, they invaded Algeria. This was the beginning of the Second French colonial empire, and this time, they focused on Africa. Over the next few decades, France built an absolute monster of an empire in Africa. They took Senegal, Guinea, Ivory Coast, Benin, Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, Mauritania. Then they moved into Central Africa, Gabon, Congo, Chad, Central African Republic. Then North Africa, Tunisia, Morocco. By the early 1900s, France controlled a massive chunk of the continent. But they didn't stop there. They went to Southeast Asia and took Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. That became French Indochina. They went to the Pacific and grabbed New Caledonia, Tahiti, and the Marquesas. They even got a foothold in the Middle East after World War I, picking up Lebanon and Syria when the Ottoman Empire fell apart. At its peak, the Second French Empire covered over 5 million square miles. Only the British had more. But here's the thing about empires: they don't last forever. World War II was the beginning of the end. France was occupied by Nazi Germany in 1940, and suddenly, the colonies had to choose sides. Some backed the collaborationist Vichy regime, others joined the Free French under Charles de Gaulle, and colonial troops fought everywhere: in Europe, in Africa, in Asia. They bled for France. After the war, they expected something in return: independence, or at least a path toward it. But de Gaulle had other ideas. He offered them a French Union, basically a way to stay under French control with a little more say in things. For many nationalists, that wasn't enough. The backlash was immediate. In Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh declared independence. France refused. What followed was nearly a decade of brutal war, ending in 1954 with the catastrophic French defeat at Dien Bien Phu. Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia were gone. Then came Algeria. France considered Algeria part of France, not a colony, but actual French territory. Millions of French settlers lived there. So when the Algerians rose up in 1954, France fought back with everything it had. It was a dirty war. Torture, massacres, terrorism on both sides. It lasted 8 years and nearly caused a civil war in France itself. In 1962, Algeria finally won independence. One by one, the African colonies followed. By 1960, most of French West and Equatorial Africa were independent nations. And just like that, the empire was gone. But not entirely, because scattered across the oceans, France still holds on to 13 territories. They are not colonies anymore, at least not officially. They are overseas departments and collectivities. They vote in French elections, send representatives to Paris, use the euro, and are part of the European Union. Some are well known. French Guiana, in South America, is where Europe's spaceport sits. Guadeloupe and Martinique are Caribbean tourist hotspots. Réunion, near Madagascar, is a stunning volcanic island. Mayotte, in the Indian Ocean, became France's 101st department in 2011. Then there are the more remote ones: Saint Pierre and Miquelon, just south of Newfoundland, tiny, foggy, and fiercely French. Wallis and Futuna, in the middle of the Pacific. French Polynesia, with its overwater bungalows and nuclear test sites. New Caledonia, where independence tensions still simmer. And the Kerguelen Islands, so far south they are practically Antarctic, with no permanent population except scientists and stray cats. So why does France keep them? Partly history, partly strategy. French Guiana gives Europe a launch pad near the equator. The Pacific Islands extend France's economic zone across millions of square miles of ocean. And partly pride. France sees itself as a global power, and having territory on every continent reinforces that image. But there's another legacy that's even harder to see on a map: the French language. Today, over 300 million people speak French. It's the 5th most spoken language in the world. It's official in 29 countries. It's growing fastest in Africa, where cities like Kinshasa and Abidjan have more French speakers than Paris ever will. And that's the real remnant of the empire. Not just islands and territories, but culture, language, identity. From a beaver pelt in Canada to a sugar plantation in Haiti. From a missionary in Vietnam to a legionnaire in Algeria. From the rocky coasts of Nova Scotia to the lagoons of Tahiti. The French Empire rose, expanded, crashed, rebuilt, and crumbled again. And what's left? A few dots on the map. A language spoken on every continent. And a story that connects a cold fort in Quebec to a hot jungle in Guyana. A story that reminds us that the lines on a map are never as simple as they seem. Because when you ask, where is France? The real answer is almost everywhere.